It sounds like fiction. A railgun that fires ships into outer space like a cannon. That's what China is allegedly working on. It's something straight out of a Robert Heinlein novel. The device would fling a 55-ton crude plane into the sky at hypersonic speeds as part of the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation's, or CASIC's, Tengyun project, which means Cloud Rider in Chinese. It's part of China's larger project 921-3, which is its spaceplane program, and it falls under the even larger umbrella of Project 921, China's program for manned spaceflight. The news of such a plan, which went rather viral in scientific circles, was met with considerable ridicule, especially since previous projects in other countries have been total disasters. It admittedly sounds impossibly ambitious, doesn't it? Ludicrously expensive, insanely dangerous. So is this merely a government PR stunt, or does it represent a new leap in the global race for hypersonic technology and manned spaceflight? And the answer to that is pretty complicated and requires exploring beyond the sensational headlines and understanding the numerous pieces of cutting-edge technology underpinning this mega project. Not a railgun. Now, before we get into anything else, I should clear up that what China is building is not a railgun, not technically. Now, a railgun features two rails like train tracks, electrified with a massive current of at least 1 million amperes. To complete the circuit, a projectile is placed in between the two rails. The current runs up one rail, through the projectile, and down the other. A magnetic field forms around the rails, and because the current runs opposite to each other, they combine to form a much stronger magnetic field pointing upward at a 90-degree angle to the rails. The projectile sitting across this magnetic field is then subject to the Lorentz forces, which pushes it violently down the track. You might think this does have potential for spaceflight, and in fact NASA has proposed just that in a way very similar to the Chinese plan. However, one of the reasons the railgun claim was met with such derision is the intense friction and heat generated in these machines, so much so that the rails swiftly erode. And many railguns, they only endure 2 or 3 uses. While they could theoretically be used to launch spacecraft, this fact means they'd hardly be cheaper or more efficient than current methods, namely rockets. For the time being, most research is devoted to using railguns as weapons. Incidentally, the Chinese military leads the way in this regard as well. In 2018, leaked photos revealed a railgun mounted to the bow of a Yutling 1-class Navy ship. Shortly after, China confirmed the photos and revealed they were testing the weapon at sea. All that said, it is true that the Tengyun project relies on launching a projectile, but China's plan forgoes rails altogether. Rather, it's said to be a coil gun. In a coil gun, rather than parallel rails, the track consists of a series of electromagnetic coils. The coil ahead of the projectile, or train, is electrified, creating magnetic pull. As the projectile reaches the coil, the electricity is then turned off and immediately turned on for the subsequent coil, pulling the projectile down the tube. Additionally, the Tengyun launcher will feature a maglev track. In this case, the projectile does not roll along a track of rails or anything else. Another set of magnets cause the projectile to levitate within the tube, suspended in midair, hence the name. This reduces friction, which not only allows for higher speeds, but also eliminates the problem of constantly eroding rails. Alright, so why? Now you might be thinking, okay, railgun, coil gun, whatever. It's just semantics. It still seems like an incredibly complex and expensive piece of machinery when rocket technology just keeps getting cheaper and easier to produce. And I'll address the importance of the coil gun shortly, but first, let's clear something up. It's not just that the Tengyun project isn't a railgun, it isn't a space gun at all. Sometimes called a Verne gun, thanks to Jules Verne's novel From Earth to the Moon, in which a gun club builds a literal cannon to shoot a projectile to the moon, a space gun relies solely on the power of the launcher to send a projectile all the way into outer space. This is where the sensationalism of the story has been really misleading. In reality, the coil gun will serve more like a runway to launch a 55-ton hypersonic plane capable of flying at Mach 7. That's 7 times the speed of sound, which is about 5,300 miles per hour. If you're having trouble wrapping your head around that, it's nearly 2.5 kilometers, that's 1.5 miles, every single second. To achieve this insane velocity, the Tengyun plane will rely on Ramjet and Scramjet engines. Understanding this technology is fundamental to understanding the entire project. A ramjet is essentially defined by how it's different from a standard turbojet engine, those huge machines with the terrifying spinning blades that you see hanging off the wings of 737s. To turn fuel into acceleration, a turbojet engine relies on the Brayton cycle, which is often described as suck, squeeze, bang, blow. First, these giant blades suck air into the engine, forcing it into increasingly smaller pockets. This squeezes the air and increases its pressure. Finally, the engine ignites the fuel for the bang, and the highly pressurized air blows out of the back of the engine. This force accelerates the engine and therefore the plane forward via Newton's third law of motion, and it spins a turbine, which in turn spins the fan blades at the front of the engine, sucking in more air. The limits of the turbojet are all the moving parts, the turbine and the blades. At high supersonic speeds, the compressor blades at the front of the engine simply cannot handle it. The air hitting them is too fast and too hot. Even if they don't break, shockwaves created by the supersonic velocity interrupt the smooth flow of air, and the engine chokes. The same's true for the turbine in the back. It's liable to melt from the intense heat or spin so fast that it breaks apart. The ramjet solves this problem by getting rid of all of those moving parts. In fact, the engine is relieved of its sucking duty in the Brayton cycle altogether. Instead, it takes advantage of the supersonic airspeed. The incredibly fast air rams into the front of the engine, where the simple shape of the engine itself forces it to slow down to subsonic speeds. However, the laws of physics demand that this immense kinetic energy be maintained, and so it's converted into pressure. Like in a turbojet, this highly pressurized air then reacts with the ignited fuel, and the resulting exhaust is blown out the back. The problem with ramjets is that they can't start from a standstill. In fact, even at the speed of sound, they don't work. After all, the air has to be ramming into them, and an aircraft typically has to already be moving at about Mach 2 or about 1,500 miles per hour before the ramjet can even start working. Usually the solution to this problem is to combine turbojets and ramjets into what's called a turbine-based combined cycle engine, or TBCC. The plane initially accelerates using a standard turbojet engine, and once it reaches supersonic speeds, the turbine and compressor blades are shut off and bypass tubes open that change the shape and design of the engine to that of a ramjet. This was exactly the setup of the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, a strategic reconnaissance plane used by the US Air Force from 1964 to 1998 that still holds the speed record for a crewed air-breathing aircraft. On July 28, 1976, a Blackbird in California reached a speed of about 2,200 miles per hour, or Mach 3.3. The Scramjet is an even more impressive beast. While a ramjet can provide much higher velocities than a traditional turbojet, it still has a limit of about Mach 5, or 3,800 miles per hour. At that point, the difference between the high speed of the air and the low speed it must be slowed to before ignition is just too great. Slowing it down this much creates too much drag, and temperatures get so high that they risk damaging the engine. Standing for supersonic combustion ramjet, a scramjet bypasses this problem by slowing the air down less. When it enters the combustion chamber, it's still moving at supersonic speeds. This isn't as easy as it sounds. Have you ever tried to light a candle in the wind? And no, the wind is not even close to supersonic. In a scramjet engine, any given particle of air only spends milliseconds within the combustion chamber, so reacting it with fuel is a major challenge. Much of scramjet research remains classified, so how these machines accomplish this engineering feat is still partly a mystery. However, we do know that in addition to hyperactive fuel like hydrogen, scramjets utilize small cavities that create vortices of slower-moving air that can then create what are essentially pilot lights that remain ignited. The powerful river of supersonic air passing over it is then constantly combusted. Scramjet engines were utilized in the fastest air-breathing aircraft flight to date. In 2004, a test flight of NASA's X-43A reached Mach 9.68, or nearly 6,800 miles per hour. However, like all experimental planes and missiles that have utilized scramjets, the X-43A was uncrewed. Additionally, it did not rely on a TBCC and did not take off on its own. Instead, a B-52 Stratofortress carried the test plane to a high altitude and then dropped it, at which point a Pegasus rocket ignited, accelerating the stack to Mach 10. The plane then separated from the rocket, and then the scramjet engine ignited at Mach 9.65 and ran for 10 to 12 seconds. So, the Tengyun project is clearly ambitious in a couple of ways. First of all, it's going to actually put a human being in this hypersonic aircraft. Second of all, it isn't going to require rockets to accelerate the plane to the hypersonic speeds above Mach 5 required for a scramjet to function. Instead, the Coil gun will first accelerate the Tengyun plane to Mach 1.6. this will allow the Ramjet engines to kick in. These will accelerate the plane to Mach 5, at which point the engines will convert to scramjets. Reportedly, this will allow it to reach speeds similar to the X-43A of around Mach 10. All of this solves a major problem for space travel, the tyranny of the rocket equation. To reach Earth's escape velocity, which is 11.2 kilometers a second, around 25,000 miles per hour, or Mach 33, most of the weight of a rocket has to be devoted to fuel. That's because so much is needed to get up to those speeds. As for Tengyun, it will already surpass the speed of sound without using any onboard fuel at all, and after that it will rely on atmospheric oxygen to reach hypersonic speeds. Of course, this comes with a rather large set of other problems. This is getting complicated. Now, hold on a second. If you're paying attention, you just noticed a major contradiction. How can the Tengyun be a spaceplane running on scramjet engines if scramjet engines require atmospheric oxygen to function? Many news reports forgot to mention the Tengyun is actually two planes. The scramjet plane will be just a carrier. At high altitude, it will release a second plane that will utilize rockets to continue into space. And that begs the question, isn't this all just starting to get a bit complicated, especially given the long and increasingly economic tradition of multi-stage rockets? In fact, many space enthusiasts were quick to point out the numerous past failures of this very technology. Most notably, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS, was installed on the USS Gerald R. Ford in 2015 to launch FA-18F Super Hornet fighter jets. While it has some advantages to the traditional steam catapults, namely that it's less stressful on the aircraft's frames, it's been largely considered a disaster. It reportedly has a failure rate 9 times the Navy's threshold requirements and only has to accelerate planes to 240 kilometers an hour, or 150 miles per hour, about an eighth of the Tengyun's proposed Mach 1.6. What's more, the US Air Force actually developed maglev launching capabilities at the Holloman High-Speed Test Track in New Mexico. They built a 700-meter or 2,300-foot prototype track with the goal of reaching Mach 10. During development, they noted several key obstacles like stability and control and aero heating. Though they eventually got sleds going close to the speed of sound, the track was deemed not suitable to meet the original intent, and the Air Force put the project on indefinite hold. Can China do better? Now, with all of the obstacles ahead of the Tengyun program and all the failed precedents, is there any chance that it actually has a chance, or is it just a PR stunt? Now, to understand that, we have to look at what China is actually building, what they plan to build, and what distinguishes this from previous American projects. The first stage of the Tengyun project is reportedly already underway in the form of a 2-kilometer or 1.2-mile test track in Datong, Shaanxi province. However, this track, which broke ground in 2021, has nothing to do with spaceflight at all, according to official Chinese press releases. Rather, it's a testing ground for a high-speed flying train. More than just a maglev track, the Datong facility is designed to run inside a virtually air-free vacuum tube. You've probably heard this type of track called a hyperloop, and CASEC officially refers to it as T-flight. While traditional maglev tracks have already proven to be efficient means of mass transportation because they eliminate friction with rails, hyperloops take it to the next level by getting rid of the air too and eliminating friction nearly altogether. This makes them incredibly efficient and incredibly fast. Whereas traditional maglev trains need 2 engines operating at 2,250 horsepower, which is about 1.7 megawatts, a Hyperloop train theoretically needs just 134 horsepower, or 100 kilowatts, that of your average car, to reach speeds of over 1,000 kilometers an hour or 620 miles per hour. That's precisely the speed CASEC wants the T-flight to reach, and as of 2024, the test trains have already hit 623 kilometers an hour or 387 miles per hour, demonstrating the viability of their Hyperloop design. The clue that the Datong track will also serve as a testing ground for Tengyun is that both are projects of the China Aerospace and Industry Corporation, a state-owned enterprise whose primary domain, as their name would imply, is not trains. The maths, though, would still seem to suggest that it is indeed only experimental. To accelerate an object from rest to Mach 1.6, or about 550 meters per second, along a track just 2 kilometers long, you need over 75 meters per second squared of acceleration. That's nearly 8 Gs, and the Tengyun crew would have to endure it for over 7 seconds. For reference, untrained people usually lose consciousness after just a few seconds at 4 or 5 Gs. Trained fighter pilots in special suits can often withstand up to 9 Gs for a few seconds, and Colonel John Stapp of the US Air Force famously withstood an insane 46.2 Gs, but for less than a second. Nearly 8 Gs for over 7 seconds is at the limit of human endurance, so it's not practical or safe for regular crewed missions. But what if the track were a lot longer than just 2 kilometers? What if it were, say, 60 kilometers? That's a little under 40 miles. Well, that's precisely the planned length for CASX Hyperloop. The 2-kilometer section is merely Phase 1, and it will be extended in Phase 2 until it's 30 times that size. If we run the numbers again, we see that this completely eliminates the G-force problem. Accelerating to Mach 1.6 over 60 kilometers requires an acceleration of about 2.5 meters per second squared over around 219 seconds. That's a bit over 3.5 minutes. That's just a quarter G, hardly even uncomfortable, much less dangerous. For reference, drivers often exceed a quarter G when accelerating after a red light, and many high-speed elevators in skyscrapers surpass a quarter G. Even a simple sneeze subjects the body to a harsher force, about 2.9 Gs on average. So, now that we've peeled away the sensationalism and the fancy buzzwords, we see that this is actually a feasible project, even if it's an ambitious one. But that doesn't mean there aren't still plenty of hurdles to jump. Where there's a will. The first obstacle to the Tengyun project is the electricity required for the Hyperloop Coil gun. The energy needed to accelerate a 55-ton plane up to Mach 1.6 is around 7.5 gigajoules. This is 2,100 kilowatt hours, which is more than the amount of electricity the average US household uses in 2 months. Considering we're talking about pumping this electricity into the maglev track in a matter of seconds, it is an insane amount of power. For the 2-kilometer test track, this translates to over a full gigawatt, equivalent to the output of a moderately sized nuclear power plant. To understand the difficulty this poses, consider that the previously mentioned EMALS catapult requires so much power the USS Gerald R. Ford's nuclear reactor is not enough to run it. Instead, the reactor's energy must be used to spin up a flywheel energy storage system for around 45 seconds at 6,400 RPM. All this stored kinetic energy is then dumped into the catapult in a 2 to 3 second burst. Since the 60-kilometer track China plans to build needs the energy over a longer period of time of a few minutes, it mostly solves this problem. The power requirement drops to just 35 megawatts, roughly the output of a large jet engine. It's still a lot, but it's not going to break the grid. The next obstacle may prove harder to overcome: the infamous separation problem. You've got a massive 55-ton object hurtling down a highly electrified tube with all the air sucked out of it at over half a kilometer per second. How do you let it go? The moment the tube opens to release the plane, air will go rushing into the vacuum, and this is the least of your problems. The plane will literally slam into a wall of stationary air. This will rattle it with a barrage of heat and friction, threatening the structural frame of the aircraft. Shockwaves from the supersonic velocity will explode outward. As if that weren't enough, in a matter of milliseconds, the plane will suddenly be subjected to lift as air rushes over the wings. However, Chinese scientists seem preoccupied with an even more problematic aspect of separation. Presumably, the plane will be carried through the Hyperloop tube on a sled, and when it leaves the tube, this sled will also create supersonic shockwaves. Despite the lift the plane experiences, the shockwaves produced by the sled, which won't experience lift, push upward against the plane's belly, forcing the nose downward. And that is very much not the direction that you want your supersonic jet plane to be traveling in, is it? Xiaowei Li, who leads a team at CASX's Institute of Magnetic Levitation and Electromagnetic Propulsion, has specifically addressed this problem in a paper published in the journal Aerospace Science and Technology. His solution is actually pretty simple. A ramp, slightly inclined, at just 1.5 degrees. It's a ski jump, basically. This little fix has solved everything, at least on paper. Simulations suggest that the plane should now separate from the track with a 3.4 degree upward pitch rather than the minus 0.25 degree downward pitch that was predicted before. The final obstacle, though, doesn't have anything to do with physics at all. It's also the most daunting: money. Remember the EMALS catapult? That cost $1.19 billion, despite being just 91 meters or 300 feet long. The Datong test track was a bit more economical, with a price tag of 5 billion won, about $700 million for 2 kilometers, and we can assume the costs per kilometer of track will decrease as it expands. Nevertheless, it's safe to assume it's going to cost billions. A true Hyperloop, such as the T-Flight, has never been built. but there have been plenty of plans and studies with mind-bending price tags. Elon Musk famously proposed a Hyperloop from San Francisco to LA with a length of 650 kilometers or 400 miles at a cost of just $7.5 billion. Just. However, the New York Times estimated that the proposal would actually cost closer to $100 billion. Similarly, a startup called Hyperloop TT and the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency, or NOACA, spent $1.3 million exploring the feasibility for a Hyperloop connecting the Great Lake metropolises. With a total cost of nearly $30 billion, the per-mile cost was pinned at $60 million or $37.5 million per kilometer. At that price, China's 60-kilometer T-flight track would cost over $2 billion. Now, these issues may not seem insurmountable, but they do seem prohibitive if the point is to make spaceflight cheaper. After all, SpaceX has gotten launch costs down to about $67 million per rocket, with a goal of just $10 million for Starship. This means that you could launch 200 Starships for the price of merely building the launcher for Tengyun. The solution to this financial problem is arguably the most ingenious aspect of the Tengyun project. It essentially is piggybacking on a civilian infrastructure project. The 60-kilometer track, phase 2 of the project, is not the end game. There's a phase 3, a 1,000-kilometer or 620-mile track creating a 1-hour economic circle between Chinese megacities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Wuhan. While they hope to reach 1,000 kilometers an hour or 620 miles per hour with the phase 3 track, CASIC has revealed ambitions for an international network with trains traveling at a blistering 4,000 kilometers an hour, which is over Mach 3, or about 2,500 miles per hour. As far as mass transportation goes, Hyperloops like these are as fast or even faster than planes while being considerably cheaper per person. Normal maglev high-speed rail can take over 100 years to pay for itself, but adding the vac tube can shorten that to a single generation. Ultimately, the Tengyun project is a prime example of China's state-level doctrine of military-civil fusion, sometimes called MCF. The idea is to develop civilian infrastructure and take advantage of private innovation in a way that directly benefits the Chinese military. In this case, what seems like an implausible sum of money for spaceflight suddenly disappears. All those resources are instead primarily devoted to a massive, nationwide infrastructure project. And hey, if it can occasionally be used to fling some people riding a 55-ton hypersonic Scramjet airplane into space, I mean, why not? Thank you for watching.